The rain came down in sheets that November afternoon in Seattle, turning the city's glass towers into blurred monuments of light and shadow. Maya Rodriguez stood beneath the awning of the Dawson Industries building, one hand pressed protectively over her swollen belly, the other clutching a worn manila envelope that held the last fragments of her brother's life. She hadn't slept in 36 hours. The bus from Portland had been delayed twice, and she'd spent the night in a terminal that smelled of disinfectant and desperation. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the impossible thing she'd discovered 3 days ago, buried in Daniel's belongings after the accident that took him. A photograph of a man who could have been her brother's twin, standing in front of this very building, dated just 2 months before Daniel died. The security guard barely glanced at her as she entered, her second-hand coat dripping water onto the marble floor. She'd rehearsed what she would say 100 times, but every version ended with the same impossible question. How can someone who looks exactly like my dead brother be alive and running a Fortune 500 company? The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like ascending through layers of someone else's reality. Maya caught her reflection in the polished steel doors. 26 years old, and looking every day of it. Dark circles under her eyes, her black hair pulled back in a practical braid. 7 months pregnant and completely alone in the world. She barely recognized herself. The reception area of the executive suite was all chrome and leather, a hushed space where money whispered instead of shouted. The woman behind the desk looked up with the kind of practiced smile that could freeze or thaw, depending on what you were worth. "I need to see Mr. Dawson," Maya said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "It's urgent." "Do you have an appointment?" The smile was already cooling. "No, but—" Maya pulled out the photograph, her hands trembling now. "Please, just show him this. Tell him it's about Daniel Rodriguez." Something flickered in the receptionist's expression. Recognition, maybe, or just pity for another desperate person who'd made it this far. She took the photograph with 2 fingers, as if it might contaminate her manicured nails, and disappeared through a heavy wooden door. Maya waited. The baby kicked against her ribs, a reminder that time was running out in more ways than one. She had $47 left to her name, no job, no family, and a due date that was approaching like a train in the dark. This was her last hope, though she couldn't have explained what she was hoping for. The door opened. The receptionist's face had changed, professionally neutral now, but with an edge of something Maya couldn't identify. "Mr. Dawson will see you. Please follow me." The office was a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the Seattle skyline like a painting of power, but Maya barely noticed the view. Her entire world had narrowed to the man standing with his back to her, looking out at the rain-soaked city. When he turned around, Maya's knees nearly gave out. It was Daniel's face, not similar, not reminiscent. It was as if her brother had aged 5 years, traded his faded jeans for a $10,000 suit, and somehow survived the accident that had killed him 4 months ago. The same sharp jawline, the same deep-set brown eyes that had always seemed to hold secrets, the same small scar above his left eyebrow from the time he'd fallen out of the oak tree in their grandmother's yard when he was 9. Ms. Rodriguez. His voice was different, deeper, more controlled than Daniel's had been, with an accent that spoke of East Coast boarding schools rather than the rough neighborhoods of East LA where they'd grown up. "Please, sit down." But Maya couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The room tilted, and she felt his hand on her elbow, guiding her firmly but gently into one of the leather chairs. "I don't understand," she whispered. The words came out broken, fractured by the impossibility of what she was seeing. Daniel died. I was at his funeral. I watched them lower his casket into the ground next to our mother's grave. Alexander Dawson, because that's who he had to be according to the nameplate on the massive desk, returned to his chair with the careful movements of a man who just realized he was holding a live grenade. "I'm not Daniel Rodriguez," he said quietly, "but I know who he was." "That's not possible." Maya's hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together over her belly. "You have his face, his exact face." "The scar, She broke off, something occurring to her that made her blood run cold. "Did you know him? Were you twins?" "I never met your brother," Alexander said, and something in his voice made Maya believe him. "But you're right to be confused, to be angry, because the truth is more complicated than you can imagine." He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a file, laying it between them like evidence at a trial. Inside were documents, medical records, photographs, and more pictures of men who all shared that same face. Different ages, different time periods, but unmistakably the same genetic blueprint. 23 years ago, Alexander began, his voice taking on the careful tone of someone confessing a sin they didn't commit but had to live with anyway. There was a fertility clinic in Los Angeles, Hamilton Reproductive Technologies. They promised couples designer babies, superior health, superior intelligence. What they didn't advertise was that they were using genetic material from a single donor for hundreds of procedures, maybe thousands. Maya felt the blood drain from her face. "No. Your brother and I, we're not twins. We're clones, in a sense. Products of the same genetic template, carried by different mothers, born in different places. I only learned about this 3 years ago when another man showed up at my office, demanding to know why we looked identical." The baby kicked hard, as if protesting this impossible story. Maya pressed her hand to her side, trying to ground herself in that small, certain movement, the one thing that made sense in a world that had just inverted itself. "My mother," she said slowly, each word a stone she had to lift. "Struggled to get pregnant for years before she had Daniel. She went to a clinic in LA. She never talked about it much, said it was too painful to remember the disappointment before it finally worked." Alexander nodded, his expression a mixture of sympathy and something darker, maybe guilt, maybe grief. Hamilton Reproductive Technologies. They were shut down 22 years ago for ethical violations. But by then, they'd already created hundreds of us. We're scattered across the country, brothers who never knew each other existed. Maya stared at the files, her mind trying to process information that seemed to come from a science fiction novel rather than her real life. In the photographs, she saw version after version of Daniel's face. A doctor in Boston, a teacher in Montana, a musician in New Orleans. All of them carrying the same eyes that had looked at her across breakfast tables and Christmas mornings for 23 years. "How many?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "We don't know. The clinic destroyed most of their records before the authorities could seize them. I've been funding a private investigation for 3 years, trying to find as many of the others as possible. So far, we've located 47, but there could be hundreds more." The rain had intensified outside, and thunder rolled across the city like the universe commenting on the absurdity of human ambition. Maya felt untethered, as if everything she thought she understood about her family, about identity itself, had been revealed as a beautiful lie. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why did they do this?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "Dr. Marcus Hamilton, the clinic's founder, was a geneticist who believed he'd isolated something he called optimal human genetic material. He was obsessed with the idea of creating a superior generation. He used his own modified genetic code as the template, convinced he was giving humanity a gift. He was insane, Maya said flatly. Yes. Alexander's voice was heavy with agreement. And my investigation has uncovered something worse. Hamilton didn't just use his genetic material. He engineered certain traits, certain predispositions. He was trying to create people who would be successful, driven, intelligent. He succeeded, mostly. Most of us, most of the brothers I've found, have achieved remarkable things in our fields, but the cost... He trailed off, and Maya saw genuine pain cross his face, the first raw emotion she'd seen from him. What cost? We're not quite human, Ms. Rodriguez, not in the way that matters. Hamilton removed something essential in his tinkering, the genetic variations that make people resilient to stress, that allow for emotional flexibility. We're brilliant, many of us, but we're also fragile. 3 of the brothers I've located have committed suicide. 5 more struggle with severe depression or anxiety disorders. Your brother Daniel... Don't! Maya's voice came out sharp as broken glass. Don't you dare analyze my brother like he was some kind of failed experiment. Alexander raised his hands in apology, but his eyes, those impossible eyes that were and weren't Daniel's, held steady on hers. I'm not trying to diminish who he was. I'm trying to explain why we're all carrying the weight of someone else's ambition, why we feel like we're living borrowed lives. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Maya felt something cold settle in her chest. She looked down at her swollen belly, then back up at Alexander Dawson. The baby, she said slowly, and watched his expression shift from sympathy to something like horror. Daniel was the father. If what you're saying is true, if he was carrying this genetic material, this engineered DNA... We don't know how it passes on, Alexander said quickly, but she could hear the uncertainty beneath his words. The children we've documented so far seem healthy, normal, but the truth is, we're in uncharted territory. Hamilton's work was too secretive, too unethical. We're figuring this out as we go. Maya stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor. She felt trapped suddenly by this office, by this information, by the weight of choices she'd never made but had to live with anyway. I need to think, she said. I can't... Wait. Alexander was on his feet too, reaching out but not touching her. You came here for a reason, not just to understand the connection to Daniel. What do you need? And there it was, the question that had been hiding beneath all the others. Maya looked at this stranger who wore her brother's face, who lived in a world of wealth and power that she'd only ever seen through television screens, and felt the last of her pride crumble. I'm alone, she said simply. No family, no money, and in 2 months I'm going to have a baby who's connected to all of this, whether I want them to be or not. I came here because I didn't know where else to go. Alexander Dawson had built an empire on calculated decisions, on seeing 3 moves ahead in every negotiation. But as he looked at Maya Rodriguez, exhausted, pregnant, and carrying the genetic legacy of a mad scientist's dream, he felt the careful architecture of his life shift beneath him. Stay in Seattle, he heard himself say. Let me help you. Maya's laugh was bitter, broken. Why? Because we're what? Accidental family? Because my brother was your genetic duplicate? That doesn't make us anything to each other. No, Alexander agreed, moving to the window where the rain continued its relentless assault on the glass. But it makes your child my responsibility, and maybe... He paused, choosing his words with the precision of a man who'd spent 3 years trying to articulate something that had no name. Maybe it gives us both a chance to understand what Daniel couldn't, what none of us have fully grasped yet, which is whether we're more than the sum of our engineered parts. He turned back to face her, and for a moment, Maya saw past the expensive suit and the corner office to something raw and uncertain. I have everything, Ms. Rodriguez. Money, power, success. Everything Hamilton designed us to achieve. But I wake up every morning feeling like I'm living someone else's life, following a script I never agreed to. When I found out about the others, about Daniel and the rest, I thought understanding the origin would give me answers. Instead, it just gave me more questions. Maya sank back into the chair, suddenly too tired to maintain her defenses. Daniel struggled too, she said quietly. He was brilliant, could have been anything he wanted, got a full scholarship to Berkeley. But he dropped out after a year, said he felt like he was watching himself from outside his body, going through motions that didn't mean anything. He worked construction, played guitar in bars, tried to find something that felt real. Did he? I don't know. He died before he could tell me. She pressed her palm against her belly, feeling the baby's movements like messages in code. He was driving home from my apartment the night of the accident. We'd had dinner, talked about the baby. He seemed lighter somehow, like he'd finally figured something out. And then 3 hours later, the police were at my door telling me his truck had gone off Highway 101 in the rain. Alexander's expression darkened. What section of 101? Near Cannon Beach. Why? He returned to his desk, pulled up something on his computer, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. Because 2 of the other brothers died in single-vehicle accidents in the past 18 months. One in Montana, one in Arizona, both ruled accidental, both on rainy nights, both men who'd recently contacted me about the Hamilton connection. The cold that had been settling in Maya's chest spread through her entire body. You think someone killed Daniel? That these weren't accidents? I don't know, Alexander said, but his voice carried a weight that suggested he suspected more than he was saying. But I've hired investigators. There are people who would prefer the Hamilton scandal stayed buried. The clinic had powerful clients, and some of them have become even more powerful in the years since. If word got out about what was done, about the hundreds of genetically modified children walking around, it would destroy reputations, careers, fortunes. Maya finished his thought, feeling sick. And you think they'd kill to keep that from happening? 3 years ago, I would have said no. That we live in a civilized society with laws and consequences, but the more I've learned about Hamilton's operation, the darker it gets. He didn't work alone, Maya. He had partners, investors, clients who knew exactly what they were paying for. And those people have a lot to lose. Maya stood again, this time with purpose rather than panic. Then why are you telling me this? If there are people willing to kill to keep this quiet, why would you bring my baby, into the middle of it? Alexander met her gaze, and for the first time since she'd entered his office, Maya saw something in those familiar eyes that reminded her achingly of Daniel, not the successful, driven version that Hamilton had designed, but the uncertain, searching person her brother had been trying to become. Because hiding didn't save Daniel, he said softly. And it won't save any of us. The only way through this is together, all of the brothers, all of the families, building something real out of the lie we were born into. By the time Maya left Dawson Industries that evening, the rain had softened to a mist that hung over Seattle like a veil between worlds. Alexander had insisted on arranging everything, A furnished apartment in a secure building, a driver to take her there, a bank account with enough money to cover her expenses for the next year. She'd wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain the independence that had been her only constant since Daniel died. But pride was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. The apartment was in Capitol Hill, on the 8th floor of a renovated building with security cameras and a doorman who nodded respectfully as she entered. Inside, she found a space that was both impersonal and oddly comforting. Modern furniture in neutral tones, a kitchen stocked with basics, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city lights spreading like constellations beneath the low clouds. Maya dropped her bag by the door and moved to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Somewhere out there, scattered across the country, were dozens of men who shared Daniel's DNA, his face, possibly his struggles. And somewhere out there, maybe, were people who'd wanted him dead. Her phone buzzed, a new message from an unknown number. She opened it warily, half expecting a threat now that Alexander had planted that seed of paranoia. Instead, she found a photograph of a young man sitting on a porch somewhere rural, guitar in hand, grinning at the camera with Daniel's smile. The message read, "This is Marcus Chen. I'm one of the brothers. Alexander said you might want to see proof that we're real, that this isn't some elaborate joke. I'm a music teacher in Asheville. Never knew I had genetic brothers until last year. Would love to talk if you're up for it. No pressure. Just, we're here. You're not alone." Maya felt tears prick her eyes, the first she'd allowed herself since entering that office and having her understanding of reality dismantled. She texted back, "Thank you. I need time, but thank you." More messages arrived over the next hour. A doctor in Chicago, an artist in Santa Fe, a marine biologist in San Diego, each one sharing a photo, a story, a piece of the puzzle that Hamilton had scattered across the country. Some were successful, wealthy, powerful, the ones who'd fulfilled Hamilton's vision. Others had struggled, failed, rebuilt themselves into something the geneticist never could have predicted. And all of them carried the weight of knowing they were experiments, accidents of ambition, beautiful and broken in equal measure. Around midnight, Maya finally allowed herself to lie down on the bed, a real bed, with clean sheets and pillows that smelled like lavender. The baby had settled into a quieter rhythm, the kicks gentler now, almost contemplative. She placed both hands over her belly and whispered into the darkness. "I don't know what you're going to be, what pieces of Daniel you'll carry, what pieces of Hamilton's design will show up in your eyes or your hands or your heart. But I promise you this, you'll know the truth. You'll know where you came from, and you'll get to decide what that means. Nobody else gets to write your story." Sleep came eventually, heavy and dreamless, the first real rest she'd had in days. But when she woke to gray morning light filtering through unfamiliar windows, Maya found a new message waiting on her phone. This one from Alexander, sent at 3 a.m. "One of my investigators found something in Daniel's apartment. Papers he'd been collecting about Hamilton, about the clinic, about specific clients. He was researching this before he died, Maya. He knew. And I think he found something that got him killed. We need to talk. Soon." The coffee shop where they met was tucked into a quiet corner of Fremont, far from the polished towers of downtown. Alexander arrived first, looking different in jeans and a worn leather jacket. More human somehow, less like the corporate titan, and more like someone Daniel might have been friends with in another life. Maya slid into the booth across from him, accepting the herbal tea he'd ordered for her with a grateful nod. Outside, Seattle was waking up under a sky that couldn't decide between rain and reluctant sunshine. "Show me," she said without preamble. Alexander pulled a slim folder from the messenger bag at his side. Inside were photocopies of documents, handwritten notes, printed articles, photographs of men in suits at charity galas and political fundraisers. Maya recognized some of the faces from news programs, from the covers of business magazines, senators, CEOs, tech billionaires. Daniel had been tracking former clients of Hamilton Reproductive Technologies, Alexander explained, his voice low despite the empty shop. People who'd used the clinic knowing exactly what they were getting, children designed to be exceptional, and he'd found something connecting them, a pattern. What kind of pattern? They're all part of something called the Prometheus Initiative. It's presented publicly as a think tank focused on human advancement, genetic research, longevity studies. But Daniel's notes suggest it's really a network protecting Hamilton's legacy and the people who benefited from it. Maya's hands tightened around her mug. Protecting it how? By silencing anyone who threatens to expose what really happened. By funding research that legitimizes genetic engineering while distancing it from Hamilton's illegal methods. And by tracking us, the brothers, documenting our lives, our successes, our failures, using us as data points to prove that genetic enhancement works. That's insane, Maya breathed. We're people, not lab rats. To them, we're both. We're proof that their investment paid off. Alexander's jaw clenched, and Maya saw the anger he'd been keeping carefully controlled. Daniel figured this out about 6 months before he died. He started reaching out to other brothers, trying to warn them. He even contacted a journalist about doing an expose. And then someone made sure he couldn't tell anyone. The words came out flat, certain. Maya felt something harden in her chest, grief crystallizing into something sharper, more dangerous. "Do you have proof?" "Not enough to take to the police, not yet." But my investigators found surveillance photos in a car registered to a shell company connected to Prometheus. Photos of Daniel's apartment, his truck, his route to work. Someone was watching him, Maya. And the night he died, his truck's brake line had been tampered with. At least that's what a mechanic I hired to examine the wreckage thinks. The official investigation never looked that closely. Maya set down her mug carefully, afraid she might shatter it otherwise. The baby was moving now, responding to her elevated heartbeat, her body's fight-or-flight response. But there was nowhere to run from this, and nothing to fight except shadows and powerful people who existed beyond the reach of ordinary consequences. "What do we do?" she asked. "We finish what Daniel started." Alexander leaned forward, his voice intense. "We find every brother we can, document our existence, our struggles, our humanity. We build a case that's too big to bury, and we expose Prometheus before they can silence anyone else. That's going to take time, money, resources. I have all three. What I need is someone who understands what this really means. Someone who knew Daniel not as a genetic anomaly or a data point, but as a person." His eyes held hers across the table. "I need you to help me tell the real story. Not the one Hamilton imagined, not the one Prometheus is trying to protect. The true story of what happens when you try to engineer humanity out of human beings." Maya thought of her brother, brilliant, troubled, searching Daniel who'd spent his whole life feeling like he was following someone else's map. She thought of the baby growing inside her, carrying forward that same genetic legacy whether she wanted it or not. And she thought of all the other brothers scattered across the country, living with the weight of expectations they'd never agreed to carry. "Okay," she said finally, "but I have one condition. Name it." When this is over, when we've exposed Prometheus and told our story, you help me do something else. You help me figure out how to give these kids, mine and anyone else's who's part of this, a chance to be themselves, really themselves, without Hamilton's ghost hanging over them. Alexander extended his hand across the table. Deal. Their handshake felt like more than agreement. It felt like a declaration of war against people who thought they could play God without consequences. And as Maya walked out of that coffee shop into the uncertain Seattle morning, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Daniel's death. Purpose. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of revelations and connections that rewove the fabric of Maya's understanding. Alexander's penthouse became their war room, walls covered with photographs of the brothers, timelines of Hamilton's operation, financial trails leading to Prometheus Initiative donors. Maya worked from the leather couch, laptop balanced on her growing belly, reaching out to brothers across the country while Alexander coordinated with investigators and lawyers. They found 23 more brothers. A firefighter in Denver who'd always felt driven to save people but couldn't explain the anxiety that came with it. A software engineer in Austin who'd built a billion-dollar company by 30 but couldn't shake the feeling that his achievements belonged to someone else. A high school teacher in rural Maine who'd rejected the corporate path entirely, finding peace in simplicity that the others envied. Each story added texture to the picture. Hamilton hadn't just created genetic copies, he'd scattered fragments of himself across America, each one playing out differently depending on the life that shaped them. Some thrived, brilliant and driven. Others crumbled under the weight of expectations coded into their DNA. And a few, like Daniel, had spent their lives trying to figure out why success felt hollow, why accomplishment never quite filled the emptiness inside. Maya documented everything, conducting video interviews that revealed not just facts, but the emotional truth of being human in a body designed by someone else's ambition. She watched Alexander transform during these sessions, saw him relax when talking to a brother who painted landscapes in Oregon, saw him lean forward with intensity when a civil rights lawyer in Atlanta described fighting for people who existed in society's margins. He was discovering that being one of Hamilton's creations didn't make them all the same. It made their differences more profound, more meaningful. But the work wasn't just academic. Every few days, Alexander's investigators would report back with more evidence of Prometheus's reach. Shell companies funding genetic research that built on Hamilton's illegal work. Political donations to candidates who opposed regulations on reproductive technologies. And most chilling, employment records showing that 3 brothers had been hired by Prometheus-affiliated companies in the months before they died. "They're not just protecting the past," Maya said one evening, staring at the web of connections spreading across Alexander's wall. "They're planning the future. They want to normalize what Hamilton did, make it legal, make it profitable. Then we need to move faster." Alexander was on his phone constantly now, setting up meetings with journalists, coordinating with the brothers who were willing to go public. "I've arranged a press conference for next week. We'll present everything, the documents, the testimonies, the evidence of Prometheus's involvement in covering up Hamilton's crimes." Maya felt the baby kick hard against her ribs, as if agreeing with the urgency. She was 8 months pregnant now, moving more slowly but thinking more clearly than she had in years. Grief had given way to determination. Loss had crystallized into purpose. "There's something else we need," she said carefully. "We need Daniel's voice in this, his research, his notes. They tell part of the story. But people need to understand who he was, why this mattered to him personally." Alexander nodded slowly. "I kept something back. I wasn't sure if you were ready to see it." He pulled out his phone, scrolled through files, then handed it to Maya. On the screen was a video, grainy, clearly shot on a phone, dated 2 weeks before Daniel died. Her brother's face filled the frame, and Maya's breath caught in her throat. "If you're watching this," Daniel's voice came through the speaker, "it means I was right to be paranoid." He laughed, but it sounded hollow. "I'm Daniel Rodriguez, and I'm what you might call a genetic experiment." Not in the science fiction way, in the very real, very illegal way that happened in fertility clinics in the 1990s. A man named Dr. Marcus Hamilton decided he could improve humanity by creating designer babies using his own modified genetic code. I'm one of hundreds of results from that experiment. Daniel leaned closer to the camera, and Maya could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the same exhaustion she'd carried for months now. "I've spent my whole life feeling wrong," he continued. "Not bad, not evil, just wrong, like I was wearing someone else's skin. Every achievement felt borrowed, every failure felt inevitable, and I could never explain it until I found out the truth 6 months ago. I'm not really me. I'm Hamilton's idea of what a person should be, and that idea is killing us, literally. Depression, anxiety, suicide. It's not coincidence. It's design. He engineered out the resilience that makes us human, the imperfection that lets us adapt." He paused, running a hand through his hair in a gesture Maya had seen 1,000 times. "But here's what Hamilton didn't count on. We can choose differently. We can take this broken design and make something real from it. I'm going to expose what was done to us, what's still being protected by powerful people who benefit from keeping this secret. And if something happens to me, I want my sister Maya to know that everything I did trying to become someone real." Someone who wasn't just following Hamilton's script. Daniel's expression softened, and he looked directly into the camera as if he could see through time to this moment. "Maya, if you're watching this, it means I failed to stay safe. But don't let that stop you. Tell the story. Tell all the stories, mine and the others. Because the only way we win is if people understand that we're not experiments or investments or data points. We're human beings who deserve to define ourselves, and so do our children, especially our children." The video ended. Maya sat frozen, tears streaming down her face, one hand pressed to her belly where Daniel's child moved beneath her palm. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew about the baby." Alexander's voice was gentle. "He came to see me 3 days before he died. Didn't tell me his name, just showed up and said he had information about Hamilton. We met at a bar in Portland, talked for hours. He told me about you, about the baby. Said he wanted to make the world safer before his child was born. I didn't realize until after, didn't connect him to the accident reports until I started investigating." Maya looked up at Alexander, seeing guilt written across features that were and weren't her brother's. "You couldn't have saved him. Prometheus was already watching, already planning. But we can finish what he started." She stood carefully, moving to the wall covered with photographs of the brothers. 47 faces, all variations on the same genetic theme, all struggling with the legacy of one man's ambition. And somewhere, scattered across the country, were more, maybe hundreds more, who didn't know yet why they felt wrong in their own skin. "Next week's press conference," Maya said, her voice steady despite the emotion coursing through her. "We don't just present evidence, we present solutions. We announce a foundation, the Daniel Rodriguez Foundation for Genetic Ethics. We fund research into helping people like us, children born from these procedures. We advocate for laws that protect against this ever happening again. And we create a network where brothers can support each other, where we build the family Hamilton tried to engineer but never understood." Alexander stood beside her, looking at the wall of faces. "That's going to take more than money." "It's going to take all of us being willing to stand up publicly, to own what we are." "Then we ask them," Maya said simply. "We tell the truth and let each brother decide if he's ready to step into it. That's the difference between us and Hamilton. We believe in choice." The Seattle Convention Center auditorium held 300 journalists, and every seat was filled. News crews lined the back wall, cameras trained on the stage where Maya sat beside Alexander, flanked by 12 brothers who'd flown in from across the country to be present for this moment. Behind them, a screen displayed photographs of all 47 brothers they'd located, along with images of the documents that traced Prometheus's connection to Hamilton's clinic. Maya's due date was 2 weeks away, and she felt enormous, exhausted, and more alive than she'd been since Daniel died. The baby had been quiet all morning, as if understanding the gravity of what was about to happen. Alexander spoke first, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years commanding boardrooms, but now wielded that power for something beyond profit. He laid out the timeline of Hamilton reproductive technologies, the illegal genetic modifications, the deliberate use of a single genetic template across hundreds of procedures. He presented financial documents showing how Prometheus Initiative had funneled money to cover up the scandal, to silence whistleblowers, to fund research that would legitimize what Hamilton had done. Then he showed Daniel's video. The room fell silent as Maya's brother spoke from beyond the grave, his words carrying the weight of lived experience that no amount of documents could match. When it ended, Maya heard several journalists wiping their eyes, saw camera operators adjusting their equipment with hands that shook slightly. Maya stood then, moving carefully to the microphone. She'd rehearsed this speech 100 times, but when she opened her mouth, different words came, raw and unrehearsed, flowing from the place where grief and hope had been wrestling for months. "My brother Daniel died 4 months ago in what was ruled an accident," she began. "But he was murdered for trying to tell the truth about what was done to him and to dozens of other men who share his genetic code. He died trying to make the world safer for his child, for my child, who I'll be bringing into this world in 2 weeks." She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby's response, a small kick, a reminder of continuity. Dr. Marcus Hamilton believed he was improving humanity by engineering out our imperfections. What he actually did was create people who struggle every day with feeling wrong in their own bodies, who fight against expectations coded into their DNA, who sometimes can't survive the weight of being someone else's vision of perfection. 3 of the men on this stage have attempted suicide. 5 more deal with severe depression. All of them have spent their lives wondering why achievement feels hollow, why success never brings peace. Maya looked at the brothers beside her, men who'd had the courage to stand up publicly, to claim their stories as their own. But here's what Hamilton never understood. We're not defined by our genetics. We're defined by our choices, by how we respond to the circumstances we're born into. These men have chosen to step forward, to expose what was done to them, to demand accountability from the powerful people who profited from Hamilton's crimes. And together, we're choosing to build something better. She nodded to Alexander, who pulled up a new slide on the screen. The Daniel Rodriguez Foundation logo, a double helix breaking into a flock of birds in flight. We're establishing a foundation dedicated to genetic ethics and support for people affected by illegal reproductive procedures. We'll fund research, advocate for stronger regulations, and create networks where brothers can support each other. We'll also be filing a class action lawsuit against Prometheus Initiative and its affiliated organizations for their role in covering up these crimes and for the wrongful deaths of at least 5 brothers, including Daniel Rodriguez. The room erupted with questions, hands shooting up across the auditorium. But before Alexander could call on anyone, the doors at the back burst open and security guards rushed in, followed by a woman in an expensive suit who moved with the confidence of someone used to controlling rooms. "This press conference is based on stolen documents and libelous claims," she announced, her voice cutting through the chaos. "I'm Rebecca Thornton, legal counsel for Prometheus Initiative, and I'm here to inform you that we will be pursuing criminal charges against Mr. Dawson and Ms. Rodriguez for defamation, corporate espionage, and conspiracy." Maya felt her heart rate spike, felt the baby react with a series of hard kicks. But Alexander stood calmly, meeting Rebecca Thornton's gaze with the kind of certainty that came from knowing you held the winning hand. "Pursue whatever charges you'd like, Ms. Thornton. But you should know that everything we've presented today has been verified by independent forensic accountants, geneticists, and legal experts. We have testimony from former Hamilton employees, financial records showing Prometheus's payments to silence witnesses, and evidence that your organization hired private investigators to surveil my genetic brothers. You're welcome to sue. In fact, I'm counting on it. Discovery will be fascinating." Rebecca Thornton's composed expression cracked slightly. She looked at the cameras still rolling, at the journalists frantically taking notes, and seemed to calculate something. Then she turned and walked out as abruptly as she'd entered, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. The room exploded with questions again, but Maya barely heard them. She'd felt something shift, not just in the atmosphere of the room, but inside her own body. A tightening, a pressure that she recognized instinctively, even though she'd never experienced it before. "Alexander," she said quietly, gripping his arm, "I think my water just broke." The hospital room was private and quiet, located in the maternity ward of Seattle General, with security stationed outside the door. A precaution Alexander had insisted on after Rebecca Thornton's appearance at the press conference. Maya lay in the bed, hooked up to monitors that beeped steadily with her heartbeat and the baby's, riding out contractions that came in waves of increasing intensity. It was 3 a.m. now, 8 hours since her water had broken in front of 300 journalists. The story had exploded across every news outlet, trending on social media, dominating cable news, sparking debates about genetic ethics and corporate accountability. But inside this room, the world had narrowed to something more immediate and primal, the ancient process of bringing new life into an uncertain world. Alexander sat in the chair beside her bed, looking exhausted and overwhelmed and more human than she'd ever seen him. Over the past hours, they'd talked in the spaces between contractions, about Daniel, about the brothers, about the future they were trying to build. And somewhere in those conversations, something had shifted between them. They weren't strangers anymore, weren't just connected by genetic coincidence. They'd become something harder to define, but more essential. Chosen family. He would have loved this, Maya said during a lull, her voice hoarse from breathing through pain. Daniel, I mean. The chaos, the drama, the powerful people scrambling. He always said the truth was the best revenge. He was right. Alexander squeezed her hand gently. Prometheus's stock dropped 40% today. 3 board members have resigned. The FBI has opened an investigation into Hamilton Reproductive Technologies and everyone connected to it. Your brother set all of this in motion. He just didn't get to see it through. Another contraction built, and Maya gripped the bed rails, breathing through it with the focus the nurse had taught her. When it passed, she found herself thinking about Hamilton, not the monster who'd engineered human beings like products, but the person he must have been before ambition consumed him. Had he started with good intentions? Had he believed he was helping humanity? Or had he always seen people as raw material for his vision? Do you think we're doing the right thing? She asked suddenly. Exposing all of this, bringing attention to the brothers. Some of them might have preferred not to know. Some might have been happier living in ignorance. Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering. Maybe. But ignorance doesn't change what we are. It just means we're navigating it alone, thinking we're broken rather than understanding we're dealing with someone else's mistakes. Daniel chose truth, even though it killed him. I think we owe it to him, and to everyone else affected, to finish what he started. The door opened, and Dr. Sarah Chen entered. One of the brothers' wives, a geneticist who'd volunteered to oversee Maya's delivery after learning about the Hamilton connection. She checked the monitors with practiced efficiency, then smiled. You're almost there. Another hour, maybe less. Are you ready to meet your baby? Maya felt tears prick her eyes. Hormones and exhaustion and overwhelming emotion all tangled together. I don't know if anyone's ever really ready. But yes, I'm ready. The next hour passed in a blur of intensity, pain and pressure, and the primal work of labor that connected her to every woman who'd ever brought life into the world. Alexander stayed beside her the whole time, holding her hand through contractions, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth, whispering encouragement in the spaces between pushes. And then, with a final surge of effort that felt like it might split her apart, the baby was born. The cry that filled the room was strong and indignant, the sound of a person announcing their arrival on their own terms. Dr. Chen placed the baby on Maya's chest, warm and slippery and absolutely perfect. It's a girl, the doctor said softly. A healthy, beautiful girl. Maya looked down at her daughter, at the small face scrunched up in newborn outrage, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. This child carried Daniel's genes, Hamilton's design, the entire complicated legacy of what had been done. But she was also entirely herself, unique, irreducible, already writing her own story with every breath. Elena, Maya whispered, naming her daughter after their grandmother who'd raised them when their mother died. Elena Rodriguez. After the woman who taught us that family is what you choose, not what you're born into. Alexander leaned forward, and Maya saw tears streaming down his face. This man who looked like her brother, but had become something different, something chosen. He reached out one finger, and Elena grasped it with surprising strength. "Hello, Elena," he said quietly. "Welcome to the family. The real family. The one we're building out of truth and choice and love. It's messy and complicated and sometimes dangerous, but it's ours." Over the next few hours, as dawn broke over Seattle and turned the hospital windows golden, the world outside continued its reaction to their revelations. Maya's phone buzzed constantly with messages from brothers across the country. Congratulations for Elena's birth, mixed with updates about Prometheus's collapse, about the FBI investigation expanding, about more brothers coming forward with their stories. Marcus Chen, the music teacher from Asheville, sent a video of himself playing guitar and singing a lullaby he'd written for Elena. The doctor from Chicago sent a care package full of baby supplies and a note. "For the next generation, may they write their own songs." The marine biologist from San Diego sent a photograph of himself holding his own 6-month-old daughter, with the caption, "They're not our redemption, they're just themselves." And that's enough. By afternoon, when Maya finally allowed herself to sleep with Elena tucked against her chest, the world had shifted in small but significant ways. 2 senators had announced plans to introduce legislation regulating genetic modification in reproductive procedures. Harvard had launched an ethics investigation into research funded by Prometheus. And most importantly, 12 more brothers had contacted Alexander's foundation, ready to add their voices to the growing chorus demanding accountability. Rebecca Thornton had been right about one thing. They had started a war, but it wasn't the war she'd threatened. It was a war against the idea that human beings could be designed, improved, engineered into someone else's vision of perfection. It was a fight for the right to be imperfect, to struggle, to fail and grow and define yourself on your own terms. 3 days later, when Maya was finally ready to leave the hospital, she found the lobby filled with photographers and journalists. But she also found something else. 17 brothers who'd flown into Seattle to form a protective corridor, walking her and Elena to the car with the kind of fierce protectiveness that came from truly understanding what it meant to be vulnerable in a world that saw you as data rather than human. Alexander drove them to the apartment, where Maya found it transformed. The neutral modern space had been filled with life, baby supplies organized with military precision, a crib assembled by a brother who was a carpenter in Oregon, walls decorated with photographs of all the brothers and their families, a blanket crocheted by the teacher from Maine with Elena's name stitched in soft blue thread. "We take care of our own," Alexander said simply, helping her settle into the rocking chair by the window. "That's what family means, the real kind." Maya looked down at Elena, sleeping peacefully despite all the chaos surrounding her birth. This child would grow up knowing the truth, knowing that her genetics carried a complicated history, that her existence was tangled up with illegal experiments and corporate conspiracies, and an uncle who died trying to make the world safer. But she would also grow up surrounded by chosen family, by people who understood that you didn't have to accept the story someone else wrote for you. "Your daddy wanted you to be free," Maya whispered to her sleeping daughter. "Free to be whoever you choose to be, to write your own story. And I promise you, Elena, you will be. We all will be." Outside the window, Seattle spread out beneath them, a city of rain and reinvention, where people came to start over, to build new lives from the pieces of old dreams. And somewhere in that vast urban landscape, 47 brothers were living their lives, making their choices, slowly learning that they were more than Hamilton's design, more than Prometheus's investment. They were human beings in all their complicated, imperfect glory, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. If you found meaning in Elena's story, subscribe for more tales of truth, family, and the courage to define yourself. Share this with someone who needs to remember that we're all more than what others designed us to be.